The year was 1566. 100,000 Ottoman soldiers stood before a fortress made of mud and wood in the middle of the Hungarian marshes. Inside that fortress were 2,300 men. The odds were 43 to 1. Military strategists of the time all agreed. The fortress of Sigetvar could not hold for more than 3 days. The fortress held out for 33 days. During those 33 days, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers fell in the mud. The greatest sultan in the history of the Ottoman Empire, the man who conquered more than 40 nations, Suleiman the Magnificent, lay waiting in the command tent with the exhausted body of a 72-year-old man tormented by gout. And then he died. But behind those collapsing walls, one of the greatest lies in history was being constructed. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha concealed the Sultan's death. For weeks, in front of 100,000 soldiers, a colossal war machine continued fighting under the command of a lifeless corpse. This was the Battle of Sigetvar, where the will of a Croatian count walked into death in silk ceremonial dress, and the terrifying lie of a Grand Vizier together changed the map of Central Europe forever. To understand why the Battle of Sigetvar had history-changing significance, we need to understand that what was moving toward that mud fortress was not just an army, it was an entire empire on the move. In 1566, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, from North Africa, through the Middle East and the Balkans, to the Black Sea region. It was one of the wealthiest, most populous, and most organized powers in the world at the time. At the center of that machine was the Ottoman army, elite janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, heavy artillery, siege engineers, supply convoys, blacksmiths, carpenters, doctors, clerics, scribes, and the entire logistical apparatus of an empire. And at the top of it all was Suleiman I, the man Europe called Suleiman the Magnificent, while the Ottomans called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. During his 46-year reign, Suleiman turned the Ottomans into Europe's obsession. He captured Belgrade in 1521, crushed Hungary at Mohacs in 1526, besieged Vienna in 1529. Rhodes, Baghdad, Tabriz, Tripoli. Each name fell into his hands one after another like dominoes. But by 1566, that sultan was 72 years old. His body was no longer the body of the man who had once ridden on horseback, leading armies across the Balkans. Gout tormented him so badly that he had to travel in a carriage with soft cushions instead of riding a horse, something almost humiliating for a warrior king. So why did he still go on campaign? The answer had several main reasons. He wanted to affirm that he was still the supreme commander, to strengthen the army's morale and show Europe that the Ottomans were still immensely powerful. Nikola Shubit-Zrinski repeatedly launched raids into Ottoman territory and Hungary. This made the Ottoman court view Zrinski as a threat that had to be eliminated. The final answer lay in one name: Vienna. In 1529, Suleiman had reached the gates of Vienna but could not capture the city. Weather, logistics, and distance forced him to retreat. But in the mind of a sultan accustomed to victory, it remained a wound that had never healed. Vienna was not just a city. It was the gateway into Central Europe. If Vienna fell, the greatest barrier between the Ottomans and the heart of Europe would disappear. Suleiman knew he was growing old. He knew death was approaching. But he did not want to die in a palace, on a sickbed, like a powerless old man. He wanted to end his life the way he had lived it, in a command tent, in the middle of a great campaign. And so, in the spring of 1566, Suleiman ordered a massive army to be assembled for the final Hungarian campaign of his life. About 100,000 men. But that very scale was its fatal weakness. An army like that could not move quickly. It carried heavy artillery, thousands of animals, supply wagons, ammunition, tents, and the entire support system behind it. On the rough roads of the Balkans, its speed could only reach a few dozen kilometers per day. From Constantinople to Hungary was more than 1,200 kilometers. That meant that before firing the first shot, this army had already spent weeks, enormous amounts of food, and a large part of its own endurance. Each passing day was another day of logistics being worn down. Each week of delay was another week bringing the Hungarian winter closer. And this was the paradox of Ottoman power in 1566. This army was too large to be defeated easily, but also too large to be held in place for too long. It needed a quick victory, needed to smash every obstacle on the road to Vienna. It could not waste a month before a small fortress made of earth, wood, and mud, sitting in the middle of the Hungarian marshes. But that was exactly what was about to happen. Szigetvar stood in southern Hungary, in the Transdanubia region, and by the pure logic of siege warfare, it should not have been able to hold out for even a week. The fortress was built in the middle of a vast marsh, on patches of land rising only a few meters above the surrounding muddy waters. Unlike the granite fortresses of Rhodes or Malta, which had endured Ottoman sieges for months thanks to their massive stone walls, Szigetvar was built primarily from packed earth, timber piles, and rammed mud. Its walls were no more than 10 meters high. There were no stone watchtowers. There was no deliberately constructed, deep, water-filled moat. But the surrounding marsh itself was the natural moat that no one had to dig. The fortress was divided into 3 sections, connected by narrow wooden bridges: the outer town, the inner town, and the central castle. Each section formed an independent defensive line. When one section fell, the defenders could destroy the bridge and retreat to the next. From a terrain standpoint, it was a logistical nightmare for any besieging army. The Ottoman heavy cannons required firm, level ground on which to be positioned and loaded. The mud caused cannon wheels to sink, threw the barrels off alignment, and most importantly, greatly reduced the impact of stone cannonballs weighing several hundred kilograms. Earthen ramparts absorbed impacts better than stone. Cannonballs striking mud walls created deep craters instead of shattering them as they would stone walls. You could fill a crater in a mud wall overnight. You could not repair a shattered stone wall that quickly. The Ottoman infantry faced a nightmare as well. To reach the base of the walls, they had to cross the marshland, where cavalry was almost useless, and heavily armored infantry could sink to their knees with every step. It was the perfect environment for defenders firing arrows and muskets from above, and a nightmare for attackers struggling forward through the mud. But all of that only explains why the fortress was difficult to assault. It does not explain why the men inside chose to fight to the very last. Nikola Zrinski, or Miklos Zrinyi in Hungarian, is the man history would remember forever because of this battle. He was born into a Croatian noble family with a long military tradition. By 1566, he was 58 years old, not young anymore, but still a battle-hardened and highly experienced warrior. He had served under King Ferdinand I of the House of Habsburg and had fought in numerous skirmishes against Ottoman raiding parties along the frontier. When ordered to defend Sigetvar, Zrinski understood the situation perfectly. No one was coming to save him. Habsburg Emperor Maximilian II had a large army in northern Hungary, but Maximilian was not reckless. He knew that sending his 80,000 men into a direct confrontation with 100,000 veteran janissaries would be suicide. His strategy was to wait for winter and logistics to destroy the Ottoman army, to let disease and starvation accomplish what swords and spears could not. Zrinski knew that. He knew Maximilian would not come. He knew his 2,300 men had no escape. He knew his fortress would eventually fall. But he also knew something more important than all of that. Every day he held the Ottoman army in place was another day gained for Vienna. This was not blind courage. It was one of the coldest strategic calculations in military history. The Ottoman army arrived in Hungary in August. The Hungarian winter began in October and November. From Sigetvar to Vienna was another 300 kilometers, at least 2 to 3 more weeks of marching for a slow-moving army hauling heavy artillery. If Zrinski could hold Sigetvar for 2 weeks, the Ottomans would no longer have enough time to reach Vienna before winter arrived. If he held for a month, Suleiman's campaign would, in effect, already be over. Zrinski did not choose death out of courage alone. He chose death because of mathematics. And to carry out that plan, he needed to make this siege cost the Ottomans as much blood as possible, to ensure they would not march north fueled by the momentum of victory, but instead arrive as an exhausted, demoralized, and depleted army. On August 5, 1566, the Ottoman vanguard appeared before Sigetvar. The days that followed became a lesson in the brutality of terrain. The Ottoman engineers immediately recognized the problem. It was impossible to position heavy artillery under those conditions. They were forced to spend days filling the marsh, dumping earth, stones, and timber into it, to create roads solid enough to haul the cannons forward. During that time, the defenders inside did not remain idle. They continuously fired arrows and muskets at the soldiers laboring in the mud. Every completed roadway cost dozens of lives. When the last cannons were finally in position and began bombarding the outer defenses, their effectiveness was far below expectations. Sigetvar's earthen walls did not shatter like stone. They collapsed layer by layer, creating muddy slopes that the Ottomans had to climb while being fired upon from above. The Ottomans launched infantry assaults again and again. Every assault ended in disaster. The Janissaries, the finest soldiers in the world at that time, were forced to advance through the mud in formation. They could not move quickly, they could not dodge. And Zrinski's defenders, standing atop the higher walls, were able to shoot them down as if firing at target practice. But overwhelming numbers eventually produced results. On August 19th, the outer town fell. Zrinski ordered the connecting bridges destroyed and withdrew all remaining defenders into the inner town. The outer town went up in flames, but the inner town, with fewer walls, fewer defenders, and also less room for the Ottomans to attack, became another killing ground. For nearly the next 2 weeks, the Ottomans continued their bombardments and assaults. Their casualties mounted day after day. Disease began spreading through the camp. Dysentery from contaminated marsh water became the deadly enemy of any army encamped for long periods in such damp conditions. Historians estimate that by the end of August, the Ottomans had lost between 15,000 and 20,000 men, killed in battle, dead from wounds, or dead from disease. Inside the fortress, Zrinski and his 2,300 defenders were suffering as well. After every assault, fewer men remained capable of bearing arms. By early September, only about 600 men were still fit to fight. The defensive perimeter had been reduced to the final central castle, but the objective had been accomplished. On September 6, 1566, 1 month after the siege had begun, the situation inside the Ottoman command tent became critical in a way that none of the 100,000 soldiers outside could possibly have known. September 6, 1566. Night. Inside the command tent, erected about 1 kilometer from Sigetvar, Suleiman the Magnificent breathed his last. He died of heart failure, though some sources suggest dysentery or pneumonia. But whatever the cause, the body of the greatest sultan in Ottoman history ceased to function in the quiet darkness of the military camp, less than 1 kilometer from the enemy fortress. And it was at that moment that Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, the empire's Grand Vizier, second in power only to the Sultan, had to make the most important decision of his life within a matter of minutes. No language can fully describe the pressure Sokolu was under in that moment. He stood before the Sultan's lifeless body. Around him stood only a handful of trusted attendants and the Sultan's personal physician, the only people who knew the truth. Outside the tent stood 100,000 soldiers, including 40,000 janissaries, the empire's finest warriors, but also its most dangerous. To understand why Sokolu did what he did, you must first understand the janissaries. The janissaries were not merely soldiers, they were a political power. Throughout Ottoman history, the janissaries had repeatedly revolted and overthrown sultans when they were dissatisfied. They possessed a de facto veto over the decisions of the throne. One of the essential conditions for maintaining the janissaries' loyalty was a continuous string of victories. When a campaign failed, or when a sultan died without a clearly recognized successor, the janissaries could, and on many occasions did, become an uncontrollable force of chaos. If news of Suleiman's death spread that very night, what would happen? There would be no more Sigetvar. There would be no Vienna. Those 100,000 soldiers, many belonging to rival factions loyal to different patrons in Constantinople, would instantly become opposing armies. The great commanders would each march toward the capital with their own armies, ready to shed blood in the struggle for the Sultan's throne. The Ottoman Empire, the greatest machine of power in the world, could have shattered in a single night. And inside the tent, Sokolu made his decision. No one could be allowed to know. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and terrifying acts of crisis management in history. First, seal off the source of information. The Sultan's personal physician, the only man who could medically confirm the death, disappeared. History does not record exactly what happened to him, but historians speculate that he was either assassinated or imprisoned that very night. A witness like that could not be allowed to speak. Second, dress the body. Suleiman's body was washed, dressed in full imperial robes, and seated upon the throne inside the command tent. Outside the tent, the lamps burned as they always had. Nothing appeared different to the guards standing watch. Third, forge the orders. Sokollu continued issuing the Sultan's decrees every day, ordering the attacks to continue, directing logistics, and authorizing rewards and punishments. These orders were sealed with the imperial seal and written in the familiar language and style of the Sultan, then distributed throughout the chain of command, as though the Sultan were still sitting inside the tent, watching every movement of the battle. Fourth, notify the heir. Sokollu secretly dispatched messengers to inform Selim, Suleiman's son, who was in Constantinople, of his father's death. But Selim needed time to reach the battlefield and assume command legitimately. Until then, Sokollu had to keep the machine running. For how long? Historians estimate at least 2 to 3 weeks. 2 to 3 weeks during which a dead man ruled an empire and commanded 100,000 soldiers. No one became suspicious. No information leaked out. The discipline of the Ottoman power structure, built upon absolute fear, functioned like a perfect machine, even when no one was actually operating it. On September 7th, 1566, one day after Suleiman died in the darkness, the Ottoman army concentrated its full artillery fire on Sigetvar's last central castle. Cannons positioned on ground that had taken a month to reinforce fired relentlessly at the earthen walls. An Ottoman engineering unit dug a tunnel beneath the wall and packed it with 500 pounds of gunpowder. The explosion unleashed a shockwave that could be felt several kilometers away. Part of the fortress wall collapsed. Then the fire began. It became a full-scale inferno. Ottoman incendiary rockets struck the wooden rooftops inside the fortress, the armory, and the food warehouses. Sigetvar's final central stronghold was engulfed in flames. Zrinski and his roughly 600 remaining men gathered in the castle courtyard. This was the moment when an ordinary military commander would have raised the white flag. The battle was over. There was no path to victory. No reinforcements were coming. There was no escape. Surrender was the only rational choice. But Zrinski did not choose surrender. He stood before those 600 men, Croats, Hungarians, Germans, and volunteers from many lands who had stood beside him for an entire month. Those 600 men did not run. Not one of them chose to surrender. Astia 7. The moment of pride, when death became a weapon. In the smoke-filled castle courtyard, Zrinski's surviving soldiers checked their weapons one final time. Some tightened the leather straps of their damaged armor. Others wiped the black soot from the barrels of their muskets. Some silently drew their swords from their scabbards before sliding them back in, as if making sure they were still sharp enough for the final battle. They prepared to don their armor, but Zrinski did not. He summoned a servant to bring him the red silk ceremonial robe embroidered with gold, the attire of a Croatian count. The long robe fell nearly to his knees. His black leather boots rose above his calves. Upon his head sat the familiar fur hat his soldiers had seen him wear throughout the past 33 days. Amid a castle consumed by flames, that ceremonial attire stood out like another fire. Then he placed 100 gold coins into the pocket of his robe. No one asked why. Everyone standing around him understood. According to the customs of warfare at the time, whoever killed or captured a valuable enemy commander alive would receive a reward from the Sultan's treasury. By placing 100 gold coins inside the pocket of his crimson silk robe, the very coins that would be found on his body, Zrinski was making one thing perfectly clear. I know I am going to die. I have already prepared the reward for the man who kills me. But to claim it, you must first get through me. Zrinski walked toward the fortress gate. Just behind the wooden gate stood the last field cannon still capable of firing. He ordered the cannon to be loaded with everything that remained: iron nails, broken chains, scrap iron, sharp stones, and twisted fragments of metal salvaged from the collapsed buildings. He had only one shot left. He wanted that single shot to clear the way for the final sortie. When everything was ready, Zrinski looked at his men one last time. Before him no longer stood the 2,300 men who had entered Sigetvar more than a month earlier. Only around 600 remained. Nearly every one of them was wounded. Many had strips of cloth wrapped around their arms or heads to stop the bleeding. Their armor was scarred by sword cuts and blackened by smoke. Every face was covered with dirt and ash. No one spoke a word. They simply took their positions. When everything was ready, Zrinski stood before his 600 men and ordered the fortress gates thrown wide open. Outside, thousands of janissaries were waiting for that very moment. The instant the opening was wide enough, the cannon fired. A deafening blast ripped through the air before the gate. Hundreds of jagged pieces of iron and sharp stones tore through the Ottoman ranks at point-blank range. The soldiers in the front ranks collapsed almost simultaneously. At virtually point-blank range, a cannon packed with jagged metal fragments unleashed destruction comparable to that of a modern cluster munition. The first Ottoman assault wave was swept away, screams erupted, chaos followed. Their formation shattered. It was the very moment Zrinski had been waiting for. He drew his sword and charged first. The remaining 600 men surged through the gate behind him. The battle instantly dissolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat, fought only a few steps apart. Steel clashed against steel through the gunpowder smoke. Spears snapped. Swords were chipped and battered. After firing their final shots, muskets became nothing more than heavy clubs. Croats, Hungarians, and Germans fought in small clusters around banners that were still burning. They were completely overwhelmed by numbers, yet they continued pressing forward. One by one they fell. Some collapsed right before the fortress gate. Others fell in the midst of the janissaries. Some struggled to rise one final time before disappearing beneath the sea of Ottoman soldiers. Zrinski remained at the front. According to both Ottoman and Hungarian historical sources, he was struck by multiple arrows and musket balls during the fighting. He never turned back. He never retreated. He fell with his face turned toward the Ottoman army. His crimson silk robe had become an even darker crimson, soaked in blood. Inside his pocket, the 100 gold coins remained untouched. By midday on September 7th, 1566, the final sounds of battle had finally fallen silent. The Ottoman army entered Sigetvar. What awaited them was not an intact fortress. Instead, they found shattered walls, buildings reduced to ashes, and the bodies of nearly everyone who had chosen to fight to the very last man. Zrinski's severed head was later brought back to the command tent. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha received the report of victory, while behind him lay the lifeless body of Suleiman the Magnificent. The story ended with one of the darkest ironies of the 16th century. A living man had marched willingly into death to protect a kingdom that never sent an army to save him, while a dead man had just issued the orders to crush a fortress in pursuit of a victory that no longer held any meaning. The Ottoman army captured Sigetvar on the afternoon of September 7th, 1566. On paper, it was a victory. But the numbers revealed the true cost of that victory. Casualties. Historians estimate that Ottoman losses during the Battle of Sigetvar ranged from 20,000 to 30,000 men killed or seriously wounded over the course of 33 days. That figure exceeded the combined casualties suffered by both sides at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, one of the most decisive battles in 19th century European history. A mud fortress defended by just 2,300 men had inflicted casualties on the scale of a major war. Time: September 7th marked the 33rd day of the siege. Autumn was rapidly descending upon Hungary. From Sigetvar to Vienna lay another 300 kilometers, at least 3 more weeks of marching for an exhausted army burdened with heavy artillery. After that would come the siege of a heavily fortified major city, requiring many more weeks. The calculation was simple. The Ottoman army could not reach Vienna before snow began to fall across the Hungarian plains. Logistics. An army of 100,000 men consumed roughly 1,000 tons of food every day. After 33 days of siege, combined with 2 months of marching from Constantinople, its supplies had been depleted to a dangerous level. No logistical network could replenish an army of that size quickly enough in the heart of Hungary during autumn. Those 3 factors, casualties, time, and logistics, combined into a conclusion that required no council of war for Sokollu to recognize. The Vienna campaign was over. Not because the Ottomans had been defeated in battle, but because a mud fortress had consumed everything the empire needed to advance any farther. Several weeks later, as the army began marching back toward Constantinople, Sokollu could no longer keep the secret. Suleiman's death was officially announced. It must have come as an enormous shock to the Ottoman soldiers. The campaign against Vienna was abandoned without debate. The army returned to Constantinople. Sigetvar had fallen. But Suleiman's lifelong dream to conquer Vienna and destroy the House of Habsburg had come to an end forever. The Battle of Sigetvar did not change history because the Ottomans were defeated on the battlefield. The Ottomans were not defeated. They captured the fortress. But Zrinski accomplished his true objective. He forced the Ottoman army to stop for 33 days. They turned a fortress built of earth, timber, and mud into a giant hourglass. Every passing day further eroded Ottoman logistics. Another day brought winter closer. Another day kept Vienna safe from immediate danger. For Croatia and Hungary, Nikola Zrinski became a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice. For the Ottomans, Sigetvar was a bitter victory. They captured the fortress, but lost their sultan, lost precious time, lost tens of thousands of men, and lost the opportunity to continue the campaign. They achieved a tactical victory, yet it marked the turning point that signaled the end of the Ottoman Empire's greatest era of expansion. And Sokollu Mehmed Pasha kept the Ottoman Empire from descending into chaos through one colossal lie. A lie cold enough to save an empire, yet terrifying enough that historians still debate it today. In 1566, in a marshland of Hungary, 3 decisions converged. The result was a historical paradox. In war, the weaker side does not always need an absolute victory. Sometimes, they simply need to avoid losing too quickly. The 2,300 defenders of Sigetvar accomplished exactly that. And at the cost of their own lives, they bought Central Europe 1 more month. 1 month, enough to slow the advance of an empire. Thank you for watching and listening. If you enjoy historical documentaries like this, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode.
frontier burned. But Knin under siege forced a reckoning. Doing nothing was no longer an option, and so they reached for a solution that, under normal circumstances, would have seemed almost unthinkable. They appointed a bishop as Ban of Croatia. Petar Berislavich, Bishop of Vesprem, was elevated to the position of governor just because he represented a geopolitical gamble. The logic was simple and desperate. A churchman with deep ties to Rome might be able to unlock resources that a conventional general never could. When states are bankrupt, sometimes only institutions older and richer than states can keep wars going. And that brings us to Berislavich himself. Petar Berislavich did not look like a warrior in the medieval sense, but he was something arguably more dangerous to the Ottomans at this particular moment. A disciplined administrator who understood how early 16th century warfare actually worked. Born in Trogir into a well-educated noble family, Berislavich had grown up inside both aristocratic and ecclesiastical networks. He understood law, finance, and diplomacy. And crucially, he understood a hard truth that many knights still refused to accept. Modern war was no longer won by courage alone. It was won by supply chains, payrolls, and sustained funding. When he took office as Ban, he had no standing army. Not even a small one. None at all. And just as bad, there was no money to fix any of this. The royal treasury was empty. Hungarian finances were in chaos. Asking for help from Buda was like shouting into an empty room. So Berislavich stopped waiting. He built his own war economy, piece by piece. First, he imposed direct levies on parishes within the Archdiocese of Zagreb. This was controversial, even dangerous politically, but it worked. Church income was one of the few revenue streams still functioning reliably. Next, he sold off his own estates. Then he went further and mortgaged church properties, effectively betting ecclesiastical assets on Croatia's survival. Every transaction created liquidity, cash, that could be turned into weapons, horses, food, and wages. But even this wasn't enough. The most important resource Berislavich tapped was Rome. Through his personal relationship with Pope Leo X, Berislavich gained access to something far more valuable than a one-time donation: legitimacy. Papal approval meant he could frame Croatia's struggle not as a regional border war. The frontier struggle was no longer presented as a local feud over land or feudal rights. It became a broader Christian defense against Ottoman expansion, a crusade to defend the faith. That framing opened doors to indulgence funds, emergency subsidies, and quiet diplomatic pressure on other Catholic powers. Earlier bans and commanders had burned precious time arguing with nobles over exemptions, privileges, and who owed what. Berislavich bypassed that dead end completely. He began describing Croatia as the Antemurale Christianitatis, the bulwark or forward wall of Christendom. To Rome, that phrase carried weight. It implied that if Croatia fell, the shockwaves wouldn't stop there. And Rome responded. Papal records and later financial reconstructions suggest that thousands of ducats flowed into Berislavich's war fund. To put that in perspective, one ducat could pay a professional infantryman for roughly a month. So when we're talking about thousands of ducats, we're talking about sustained military capability. Not a one-time emergency payment, but real operational funding. This new cash flow changed everything. For the first time in years, Croatia could hire professional mercenaries instead of relying entirely on under-equipped local militias. Even more important, Berislavich could finally invest in artillery and gunpowder. Firearms and small field guns were expensive, and most Croatian nobles simply couldn't afford them. Now, suddenly, they could be purchased, transported, and supplied. This mattered because warfare in the early 16th century was in transition. Cavalry was still deadly, but gunpowder was beginning to decide outcomes. A small cannon in the right place could do more damage than 100 armored men charging the right way. In the spring of 1513, Bereslavich didn't sit behind a desk in Zagreb waiting for events to unfold. He traveled, constantly. He moved across what remained of Croatian territory, meeting the great families face to face, the Zrinski, the Frankopan, families with long histories, deep rivalries, and plenty of reasons not to trust one another. Bereslavich told them that personal feuds could be settled later, if there was a later. Slowly, and not without tension, cooperation began to form. At the same time, Bereslavich built something far more modern than most people realize: an intelligence network. Local priests became his eyes and ears. They heard rumors. They saw movements. They noticed when unfamiliar horses passed through villages or when supply demands suddenly increased. Compared to older military communication systems, slow, noble-based, and fragmented, this network was fast and surprisingly reliable. In some cases, Bereslavich knew Ottoman movements days before they reached Croatian territory, and that mattered, because his enemy was already on the move. Facing Bereslavich was Junuzaga, the Sanjak Bey of Bosnia, and he was no amateur. Junuzaga was a veteran commander, deeply experienced in Akinji warfare, fast, light cavalry raids designed to terrorize, exhaust, and destabilize enemy regions before any formal campaign even began. In early summer 1513, Junuzaga led a force of roughly 7,000 elite cavalry into Croatian territory. They were mobile, aggressive, and used to living off the land. Their target zone lay between the Una and Kupa rivers, a region rich in villages, farms, and livestock. This was Croatia's soft underbelly. There were few strong fortresses there. Most settlements relied on speed and distance for safety. Against Akinji cavalry, that was a fatal weakness. Once the riders crossed into the region, they could spread out, strike multiple targets at once, and vanish before defenders could concentrate forces. This was classic Ottoman war of attrition, what modern historians often describe as a form of Kleinkrieg, small, relentless blows that slowly suffocate an enemy. Junuzaga followed the textbook perfectly. He established a fortified camp at Blinja, near present-day Petrinja. It was a forward operating base. From Blinja, Ottoman cavalry could launch repeated raids into the Croatian core, retreat safely, resupply, and strike again. By August 1513, Junuzaga commanded around 7,000 light cavalry, mostly Akinjis and Sipahis. These were experienced raiders, lightly armored, fast-moving, and confident after decades of success against fragmented border defenses. They carried short composite bows, ideal for firing on the move, curved swords like the yataghan, and just enough armor to stay mobile. Facing them was a Croatian force estimated at 4,000 to 6,000 men. It was a mix: cavalry, infantry, and a small but crucial artillery component. Some were mercenaries paid with papal funds. Others were local nobles and retainers. A few were militia. On paper, the Ottomans still had the edge in numbers and mobility. But the balance wasn't as one-sided as Junuzaga believed. Croatian troops had two advantages that didn't show up neatly in a head count. First was terrain knowledge, absolute familiarity with rivers, floodplains, forests, and seasonal changes. Second was firepower. Thanks to Vatican funding, Bereslavich could deploy early firearms and light artillery. These weren't battlefield-dominating cannons, but they were devastating in confined spaces. Since the disaster at Krbava Field in 1493, Croatian forces had been organizationally shattered. Large, coordinated resistance had basically disappeared. In open terrain, Ottoman cavalry had swept aside anything that stood in their way. so Junuzaga assumed Dubica would be no different. Which brings us to the rivers. Dubica sits at a critical junction where the Una River flows into the Sava. The Una isn't a gentle river. Its current is complex, broken by rapids, side channels, and marshy floodplains, especially around Jasenovac. By August, even though it was technically high summer, the lowlands around the Sava and the Una were still heavy with water. They were soaked floodplains, muddy, uneven, and unpredictable. On August 15, 1513, Petar Bereslavich deliberately chose Dubica as his staging ground. This was about geometry, forcing an enemy built for movement into a space where movement became a liability. His march to Dubica was a small masterpiece of maneuver warfare. Instead of approaching directly, Bereslavich moved his forces along the left bank of the Sava River, heading first toward Kraljeva Velika fortress. From there, he turned toward Jasenovac, crossed the river, and then pushed southwest. A controlled flanking movement designed to hide intent and mask strength. And this brings us to a key insight: why Dubica wasn't just a good position, but a kill zone. In cavalry warfare, space is life. Riders need room to accelerate, to maneuver, and, just as important, to retreat. At Dubica, Bereslavich removed all three. The Ottoman force was gradually pressed into an area boxed in by two major rivers. To one side, the Sava. To the other, the Una. Between them lay marshes, soft ground, and narrow approaches. If the Ottomans attacked, they would be forced to charge uphill or into Croatian infantry, anchored against higher ground or fortress positions. If they tried to retreat, the rivers waited. Crossing the Una or Sava under pressure would turn what looks like a withdrawal into a massacre in reality. This wasn't theoretical. History would later confirm it. Centuries after Bereslavich, modern armies struggled in the same area. During the Una campaign of 1995 and the siege of Dubica in 1788, troops equipped with modern weapons still found movement nearly impossible due to shifting water levels and deep mud. Bereslavich didn't need tanks or artillery barrages. He turned the rivers themselves into additional units under his command. On August 15th, Junuzaga received reports that the Croatian army had encamped at Dubica. His first reaction was cautious. He ordered additional fieldworks to be constructed around his base at Blinja, suggesting he wasn't entirely reckless. He understood that something had changed, but reports, likely distorted by Bereslavich's deliberate misinformation, painted the Croatian force as smaller, weaker, and poorly coordinated. The idea that a recently shattered kingdom could mount a serious counteroffensive still seemed unlikely to Junuzaga. After decades of easy raids, confidence had concentrated into assumption. Believing he faced a fragile opponent, Junuzaga prepared to engage under conditions that favored him, or so he thought. Junuzaga's decision to attack first on August 16, 1513, turned out to be the fatal mistake Bereslavich had been waiting for. Light cavalry surged forward in force, exactly as it had dozens of times before. Speed, shock, momentum. This was how resistance usually collapsed. But almost immediately, that momentum ran into something unexpected. At the center stood the heavy core of the Croatian army, commanded by Nikola III Zrinski, Mihovil Frankopan, and Franjo Bereslavich. They were experienced nobles commanding men who were ready, braced, and positioned to absorb impact. From the first minutes, the fighting was intense, close, loud, and chaotic. And while the central units held on the flanks, Zrinski's light cavalry moved fast. They struck from the sides, cutting into Ottoman formations and, crucially, pushing them backward, toward the rivers. Several of Junuzaga's best officers were killed in the opening clashes. Losing commanders at the start of a battle is catastrophic, especially for fast-moving cavalry units that depend on coordination and timing. Once leadership vanished, cohesion followed. Orders stopped traveling. Units began acting on instinct instead of plan. Some pressed forward blindly, others hesitated. And hesitation in a confined battlefield is deadly. This was the mirror image of Krbava Field in 1493, when Croatian leadership had collapsed and panic spread. Now the roles were reversed. As Croatian forces began to counterattack and gain the upper hand, the Ottomans discovered they had nowhere to go. Retreat routes funneled toward the Una and Sava rivers. Riders tried to escape. Men in armor were dragged under by the current. Others bogged down in mud, trapped, surrounded, and cut down. Estimating casualties is difficult, but even conservative figures are striking. Ottoman losses range from 2,000 to as many as 7,000 killed or missing. That's between one-third and nearly the entire raiding force of the Bosnian Sanjak. 4 Ottoman commanders were killed. One was captured alive. For a regional military structure, that kind of leadership loss is devastating. It doesn't just end a campaign, it paralyzes future ones. Large numbers of Christian captives were freed, returning much-needed labor and morale to frontier communities. Croatian losses, by contrast, were remarkably low. Vita Petri Berislavi, written in the 17th century by Ivan Tomko Mrnović, describes Dubica as nothing short of divine intervention. According to Mrnović, Ban Petar Berislavic's army lost only 10 men, 10, while wiping out thousands of Ottoman soldiers. If that sounds too good to be true, that's because it probably is. But here's the interesting part. Even when you strip away the exaggeration, the victory at Dubica still holds up as strategically real and historically important. Modern historians don't dismiss the text outright. Instead, they read it as a product of its time, a blend of memory, symbolism, and political messaging. Even if the exact figures are exaggerated, the ratio tells us something important. Croatian losses were extremely low relative to Ottoman casualties. The myth grew because the outcome demanded explanation. How does a poorer, smaller force annihilate a larger raiding army and walk away mostly intact? For people living in the 16th and 17th centuries, divine favor made sense. This was historical propaganda, designed to serve 2 goals at the same time. First, to strengthen Croatian and Christian identity during a period when the Ottoman threat still loomed large. And second, to elevate the status of the Catholic Church, which had invested real money into Berislavic's campaigns. Mrnović followed a familiar Renaissance formula, borrowed from writers like Bonfini or Barleti, where successful commanders are reshaped into near-mythical figures. Most importantly, the army remained intact and ready for follow-up operations, including future relief efforts toward Jajce. Jajce was the capital of the Banate of Jajce, a Croatian-held fortress sitting like a thorn deep inside Ottoman-controlled Bosnia, constantly short on food, powder, and manpower. It survived on a lifeline of supply convoys running through extremely dangerous border territory. Cut that road, and Jajce would fall. There were stretches when rations were cut so thin that a soldier might get a single hard loaf for days, and yet the garrison didn't collapse. Why? Because Dubica had proven something crucial. Small, fast counterattacks could still hurt a much larger enemy. Even when supplies were low, the soldiers at Jajce stayed aggressive. Instead of sitting behind walls and waiting to starve, they launched short, sharp raids, night attacks, ambushes along river crossings, sudden strikes against Ottoman patrols. They were 10-minute bursts of violence meant to grab food, weapons, or prisoners, and then vanish. This style of fighting was directly inspired by Bereslavic's methods. By defeating the forces of Junusaga, Bereslavich reopened that supply corridor. Food, gunpowder, medicine, everything Yaitse needed could move again. Between 1514 and 1519, Bereslavich personally organized and led multiple high-risk relief expeditions into Yaitse, slipping through tightening Ottoman pressure again and again. Each trip was a gamble. Each one kept the fortress alive a little longer. If Dubica had fallen in 1513, Jaci almost certainly would have collapsed years earlier. And if Jaci fell early, the defense of central Croatia would have fallen like a row of dominoes. Once one goes, the next becomes harder and more expensive to hold. For decades, the Ottomans had seemed unstoppable in Croatian lands. Dubica proved they weren't. News of the victory spread rapidly across Europe, carried by letters, church networks, and diplomatic channels. Suddenly, Bereslavich was an internationally recognized defender of Christendom. The Battle of Dubica is often taught today as a textbook case of how small war, low-intensity, resource-efficient conflict can be turned into a campaign-level victory. Instead of massive armies and heroic charges, it learned how to squeeze value out of every skirmish. Dubica was the moment when that long learning process finally paid off. On the Croatian frontier, war usually arrived in local Sanjak bays, regional Ottoman commanders launching raids with their own forces. Bereslavich understood he didn't need to defeat the entire Ottoman Empire. That was impossible. What he needed to do was make these local raids unbearably expensive. If every incursion cost thousands of men, experienced officers, horses, and prestige, then the system would break on its own. Even if the 10 deaths claim is pure fiction, one fact is undeniable. After Dubica, large-scale Ottoman cavalry raids into Slavonia stopped for a significant period. On December 25, 1513, Christmas Day, Pope Leo X made a very public statement. He sent Petar Bereslavich a blessed sword and a consecrated hat, the highest ceremonial honors the Church could give to a defender of the faith. In practical terms, it was a strategic signal. Rome was saying, Croatia matters. More than that, Croatia was now a priority front in the Vatican's long struggle against the Ottoman Empire. A few years later, in 1519, Pope Leo X put it into writing. In a formal letter, he referred to Croatia as Antemurale Christianitatis, the bulwark of Christendom. That phrase carried real weight. It unlocked an entire support system that simply didn't exist before. Let's put some numbers and mechanisms on that support. Between 1515 and 1517, Rome sent tens of thousands of ducats north. This money rebuilt walls, repaired towers, and paid garrisons that otherwise would have deserted. Italian engineers and artillery specialists were dispatched to the Croatian frontier. These were men who understood modern fortification design, angled walls, artillery platforms, overlapping fields of fire. Border forts stopped being medieval castles and started becoming early modern defensive systems. The Church coordinated food shipments from its estates in Hungary and northern Italy. Grain, salted meat, and wine were routed specifically to frontier garrisons like Jajci. In a war where starvation killed as effectively as swords, this was life support. Without Dubica, none of this happens. If Bereslavich hadn't proven that Croatian forces could win, the Vatican might have chosen to compromise with the Ottomans, or shifted resources toward naval wars in the Mediterranean instead. This episode only makes full sense when seen alongside what comes before and what follows. More episodes like this are coming, so consider subscribing if you don't want to miss them. If you've studied this period, or worked with related archives, I'd genuinely welcome your perspective below. And if you disagree with an interpretation, or think a source points in a different direction, leave a comment. That's how this work stays honest. Thank you for staying with me to the end. I'll see you in the next episode. The fall of Gvozdansko in the winter of 1578 left a scar that never really faded from the Croatian military memory. It became a reference point, a story people would return to whenever they talked about what it meant to hold a frontier at all costs. The siege had lasted 3 full months, from the deepening cold of autumn into one of the harshest winters anyone could remember. It set a moral standard for the borderlands, endurance to the final breath. Even Ferhad Pasha was deeply affected. Rather than ordering plunder or punishment, he commanded that a Catholic priest be brought in and that the defenders be buried with full military honors. In an age of brutal warfare, that reaction says a lot because it shows how rare this kind of resistance was, even in an age accustomed to brutal warfare. But heroism didn't stop the map from changing. After Gvozdansko, the Catholic defensive line in the Balkans collapsed further south. One by one, strong points fell back. Sinj and the Cetina Valley eventually came under Ottoman control for more than a century, roughly from 1513 to 1686. The frontier emptied. Villages disappeared. Fields went untilled. Entire regions turned into buffer zones, where survival itself was uncertain. Fast forward to 1683, and the map changes again. The Ottoman defeat at Vienna triggered what historians call the Great Turkish War, a massive multi-front conflict that reshaped Central and Southeast Europe. By 1686, Sinj was back in Venetian hands. But what they recovered was not a town in any real sense. It was a wasteland. The land had people-shaped holes in it, places where communities used to be. That's when the migration from Rama in 1687 mattered. They were refugees who knew exactly what frontier life cost. They carried almost nothing, but one object mattered more than all the rest. A 15th century icon of the Mother of Mercy. It was memory, identity, and a promise rolled into one. Proof that even if land was lost, identity didn't have to be. These people were not polished knights or uniformed professionals. They became known as the Morlachs, frontier warriors hardened by displacement. Paintings from the period, like those associated with Dinčić, show them clearly. Thick coats for harsh winters, wide belts heavy with weapons, and clothing that blended Western military styles with Eastern influences picked up over generations of border warfare. This mix wasn't cultural confusion. It was adaptation. And this matters, because these were the people who defended Sinj in 1715. They were defending a second home, built after losing the first. Their mindset was shaped by stories like Gvozdansko, stories passed down not as legends, but as warnings. They knew what surrender meant. They knew what retreat looked like, and many of them had already paid that price once. By 1714, the Ottoman Empire had reached a clear decision. The losses imposed by the Treaty of Karlowitz in